Margaret Ellis did not cry when they handed her a key to a ruined kitchen and told her it was hers. She laughed, because she understood exactly what that rusted stove and those rotted shelves were really saying: you don't belong anywhere better than this. She had heard that message her entire life, in every room that went quiet when she walked in every pair of eyes that looked at her body and decided they already knew her whole story. They were wrong before, they were wrong now, and she was about to prove it with a fire, a cast iron pot, and 50 people who needed feeding. If you've ever been handed something broken and told it was the best you deserved, this story is for you. Hit subscribe right now and follow every part of Margaret's story to the end. And drop a comment below. Tell me what city or state you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this kitchen travels. Margaret Ellis had been awake since before the roosters. That was nothing new. She had been waking before sunrise since she was 9 years old, standing on a wooden stepstool in her mother's kitchen, learning how to coax warmth out of a reluctant fire and turn whatever scraps the week had left behind to something a family could sit down and be grateful for. Poverty had been her first teacher. Hunger had taught her everything else. But this was something different from anything hunger had ever shown her. She stood in the doorway of the old stone kitchen behind Hawthorne Estate and took a long, slow breath. The smell hit her first. Mold, rust, something dead in the walls, and beneath all of it, the faint ghost of wood smoke that told her a real fire had burned here once, a long time ago. The roof was intact, barely. Morning light pushed through 2 gaps in the far wall where the stone had given way. The stove squatted in the center of the room like a wounded animal, black with rust, one leg propped on a brick somebody had wedged under it years ago to keep it from tipping. The shelves along the north wall had been eaten through by rot and time. What little remained of the food stores was a disgrace. 3 barrels of flour with the lids off and the rain-damp damage plain to see. A crate of dried beans with a crack splitting one side. 2 lanterns without oil. A tin of salt half-rusted shut. Margaret's hands balled into fists at her sides. Then she opened them deliberately, finger by finger, and made herself breathe. She had known, from the first moment she stepped off the wagon and saw Caroline Whitaker waiting for her at the top of the stone steps, that this was not going to be the beginning she had imagined on the long road from Louisville. Caroline had looked her up and down the way a woman looks at something that has been delivered to the wrong address. There had been no warmth in it, no attempt to conceal the assessment. Her pale eyes had moved from Margaret's face down the length of her body, taking in the width of her hips, the roundness of her arms, the way her dress, which had been the best she owned and had been pressed carefully the night before in the boarding house in town, pulled across her shoulders, and something in Caroline's expression had settled into a kind of satisfied disappointment, as if the woman had suspected something unpleasant and been proven right. Margaret Ellis, Caroline had said. It wasn't a question. Yes, ma'am. You came from the Beaumont household in Louisville. I did. I worked there for 4 years. Mrs. Beaumont wrote me a letter. I've read the letter. Caroline had turned before Margaret finished speaking and gestured for her to follow. Come along. I'll show you where you'll be working. She had led Margaret not into the main house, not into the large, well-appointed kitchen Margaret had caught a glimpse of through the open service door with its iron stove, its copper pots hanging in rows, its smell of spices and fresh-baked bread, but around the side of the estate, past the stable yard, past the laundry building, and all the way to the back property where the old stone outbuilding sat alone and silent at the edge of the tree line. Caroline had opened the door, stepped aside, and said, with that thin smile that Margaret already understood was the woman's particular weapon, "This will be yours. The workers' kitchen hasn't been used in some years. We've been managing their meals from the main kitchen, but it's become an inconvenience. You'll take over the workers' meals from here." Margaret had stood very still, looking at the ruined room, and said nothing. "I trust that won't be a problem," Caroline said, "for someone with your experience." The way she said experience made it mean something else entirely. Margaret met her eyes. "No, ma'am, it won't be a problem." Caroline had nodded once, that smile still in place, and walked back toward the main house without another word. And Margaret had stood in the doorway and laughed. That short, hard laugh that she didn't even mean to let out. The one that meant, "I see exactly what you're doing. I see it completely, and I am not going to give you what you're hoping for." She stepped inside and got to work. The first thing she did was find a broom. It took 20 minutes because the only broom in the building had a handle snapped in half, and she had to tie the two pieces together with a strip of cloth torn from the hem of her underskirt. She swept. She swept every corner, every shelf, every inch of floor. She moved the rusted stove herself. It was heavier than she expected, and it took 3 attempts, and left her breathing hard and her arms aching, but she moved it until she could see the flue pipe behind it, check that it was clear, and judge that the stove, for all its ugliness, was still fundamentally sound. The rust was on the surface. Underneath it, the iron was solid. "All right," she said aloud. To no one, "All right. You've got more left in you than anybody thinks. I know how that feels." She found the woodpile behind the building, not much, but enough to start with, and she built a fire in the stove carefully and coaxed it to life. When the first thin thread of smoke curled up from the chimney, Margaret felt something ease in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding tight since she climbed down off that wagon. A fire meant heat. Heat meant cooking. Cooking meant she still had something to offer. She was still surveying the shelves, mentally calculating what she had to work with, when she heard boots on the stone threshold and turned to find a man in the doorway. He was built wide and low to the ground, with a sun-darkened face and the kind of eyes that had learned to reserve judgment before they learned anything else. He held his hat in both hands and looked at her with open curiosity but no unkindness. "You're the new cook?" he said. "I am Margaret Ellis." "Tom Greer. I'm the head farmhand." He glanced past her at the room and something shifted behind his eyes. "Miss Whitaker put you in here?" "She did." Tom Greer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The men eat at 6. There's about 30 of them." "What have they been getting?" He looked at her, seemed to decide she was asking a real question and deserved a real answer. "Corn porridge mostly. Salt pork when there's extra. Bread that comes from the main kitchen, but it comes over cold." Margaret nodded slowly. "Corn porridge. Every morning?" "Every morning. Lunch is usually whatever's left from porridge, if there's anything left. Supper's salt pork and hard bread." She looked at the flour barrels. She looked at the cracked crate of dried beans. She turned back to Tom Greer and said, "What time is it now?" He pulled a watch from his vest. 4:30. "So I've got an hour and a half." She rolled up her sleeves. "Go get me 3 men who can carry wood and water." "I'll need a lot of both before sunrise." Tom Greer blinked. Then one corner of his mouth moved. "Yes, ma'am." He had 3 men at her door within 10 minutes. What Margaret produced that first morning was not remarkable by any standard she held herself to. It was bean soup, thickened with what flour she could salvage from the less damaged barrel, flavored with a smoked pork bone she found wedged in the back of a cabinet that she cleaned off and boiled until the water ran clear. Seasoned with salt and something she found in a labeled tin that turned out to be dried sage, still fragrant, still good. She made cornbread in the stove's one functional pan, watching it carefully, adjusting the temperature by feeling the heat through the iron with the back of her hand the way her mother had taught her. She sent it out while it was still hot. She stood at the door of the old stone kitchen and watched the farmhands carry their bowls back to their benches by the stable. She watched them stop and look at what they'd been given. She watched Tom Greer take the first spoonful, and she watched his face. He looked up and found her watching him, and he gave her a single slow nod. That nod was worth more to Margaret than anything Caroline Whitaker could have said to her. But the morning was just beginning, and the morning was about to become considerably more complicated. She was cleaning the stove when she heard the voice. Who authorized this? Margaret turned. Caroline Whittaker stood in the doorway of the old kitchen with the morning light at her back and her face arranged in an expression that Margaret was quickly learning meant trouble was coming, and Caroline had already decided whose fault it would be. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, keeping her voice level. "The sage, the pork bone, the extra flour." Caroline stepped inside, and her eyes moved around the room with the sharp attention of a woman cataloging damage. "These supplies belong to the estate. You can't simply use them without authorization." "I used what was here in this kitchen," Margaret said. "The supplies that were assigned to this kitchen. That flour was not meant for daily use. It was sitting in an open barrel going to mold, ma'am. Another week and it would have been fit for nothing but feeding to the pigs." Margaret paused. "The men are working a 12-hour day. Corn porridge at dawn doesn't carry a body through 12 hours of hard labor. I made something that would." Caroline's eyes came back to her face, and in them was something that went beyond simple irritation. It was the look of a woman who had expected to find incompetence and instead found efficiency, and who found efficiency considerably more threatening. "In the future," Caroline said, "you will submit your supply requests to me before the cooking begins. In writing. I will review them and approve or deny them as I see fit. Is that understood?" Margaret looked at her steadily. "The men eat at 6, ma'am. I start cooking at 4:30. If I need to submit a written request and wait for your approval, then you'll have your request ready the evening before. And if something's needed that wasn't anticipated the evening before." The two women looked at each other. Margaret could feel the exact shape of what was happening the way Caroline was drawing a line, not because she had any genuine concern about the flour or the sage, but because she needed Margaret to understand where the line was and who had drawn it. She thought about her father, who had spent his last years bent double in a warehouse moving other men's freight for wages that kept them barely fed, and who had died with the particular dignity of a man who had never once stopped working with everything he had, right up until he couldn't anymore. She thought about the way he used to say, "The work speaks for itself, Maggie. Let it speak, you just keep doing the work." "Of course, ma'am," Margaret said. "I'll have my requests ready each evening." Caroline nodded, turned, and walked out. Margaret stood very still for a moment. Then she picked up her broom. But the day was not finished, showing her what she was dealing with. She was deep in preparations for the midday meal she had found, in the back of the root cellar, beneath the old kitchen, a cache of preserved vegetables that had been sealed in the autumn and then apparently forgotten. Jars of green beans and stewed tomatoes and pickled beets, all of them still good when she heard it. Laughter, not the comfortable laughter of men joking at their work. The sharp, mean kind. She stepped to the open doorway and saw 3 of the household women from the main house standing near the stone path that ran between the old kitchen and the laundry. 2 of them she hadn't spoken to yet. The third was a young woman named Della, who had at least had the decency to nod at her that morning when she passed. But Della wasn't defending anyone now. She was looking at her feet. The 2 women Margaret didn't know were looking at her, or rather at the doorway where she stood, and one of them blonde, pretty, with a sharp chin and sharper eyes, was saying something in a half-lowered voice that carried perfectly clearly in the morning quiet. Supposed to be the new cook. Can you imagine? No wonder they put her back here, out of sight. The other one laughed and said something Margaret didn't fully catch, but she caught the shape of it. She caught the word she'd been hearing in various forms her entire life, that particular word that women used when they wanted to reduce another woman to a single dimension and leave no room for anything else. Margaret stood in the doorway and felt the familiar heat move up from her chest into her face. She could go back inside. She had done it before, she was good at it. She could close the door and let the laughter fade, and be nothing but her own breathing and the fire on the stove, and she could put everything she had into the food and let the work be the answer, the way it always had been. But Margaret Ellis was 28 years old, and she was tired. Not tired the way sleep fixes. Tired the way a person gets after years of deciding that shrinking was easier than standing up. She stepped fully into the doorway and said, calmly and clearly, "You're welcome to come in and look around, if you're curious. I've just found some beautifully preserved green beans in the root cellar. If the main kitchen wants them, I'm happy to share." The blonde woman's face went still. Margaret smiled at her pleasantly. "Or you could go about your business," Margaret added. "Either way suits me fine." Della made a small, strangled sound that might have been a laugh swallowed quickly. The blonde woman drew herself up and turned her chin away, and the two of them walked off without another word. Della lingered for just a moment, and her eyes met Margaret's, and she gave her the smallest possible nod before hurrying after the others. Margaret watched them go. Then she went back inside and found those green beans, and she put them into the pot, and she stood over the stove and let the steam come up around her face until the heat in her cheeks had settled back down to something manageable. The afternoon brought new problems. When she went to submit her first written supply request, carefully notated, itemized the way she'd learned to do accounts for Mrs. Beaumont in Louisville, she was told by the young boy who ran messages in the estate's main house that Miss Whitaker was in a meeting and the request would be reviewed when Miss Whitaker was available. Margaret asked politely when that might be. The boy looked uncomfortable and said he didn't know. She went back to the old kitchen and worked with what she had. She was measuring out the evening's flour. She had the portions calculated almost to the ounce, conserving the better supply for when she had authorization to draw from the main store when she heard different boots on her threshold. Heavier, slower, the boots of a man who wasn't in a hurry but wasn't unsure of himself either. She turned. The man in the doorway was tall, though not in a way that announced itself. Dark-haired, somewhere past 40, with a face that had been made more interesting by time rather than less. He was dressed plainly, but not the plainness of a man who couldn't afford otherwise, the plainness of a man who had stopped caring whether anyone was impressed. He looked around the room with the eyes of someone who knew it in some different version than what he was seeing now. "The stove's drawing," he said. It wasn't exactly a question. "Yes, sir," Margaret said. The flue was clear. Needed some coaxing, but it draws fine. "I wasn't sure it still would." He looked at her. "You're the new cook." "Margaret Ellis, sir." "Nathaniel Hawthorne." He said it the way a man says his name when he's not particularly interested in the effect it produces, not false modesty, just indifference to ceremony. "This is my estate." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron. "I know, sir." Nathaniel Hawthorne's eyes moved around the room again, the swept floor, the fire in the stove, the organized shelves, the jars of preserved vegetables lined up on the work table. Something moved behind his expression, though he kept his face still. "How long has this building been assigned to you?" he asked. "Since this morning, sir." He was quiet for a moment. "And it looked like this morning?" "No, sir. It looked considerably worse." Another silence. Then the men said the food was different today. Was that a problem? Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one. "No," he said. It was not a problem. He stood there a moment longer, looking at her not the way Caroline looked at her, not that measuring, diminishing look, but like a man trying to work something out that he wasn't sure he had the right answer to yet. "Miss Ellis," he said finally. "Sir, if you need something for this kitchen and you're not getting a timely response through the normal channels, you can come directly to me." Margaret looked at him. She was not entirely sure what to do with that. In her experience, offers like that one came with strings she couldn't see until they'd already wrapped around her ankle. But his face was steady and direct, and there was no performance in it. "Thank you, sir," she said carefully. He nodded once, turned and walked back toward the main house. Margaret stood in the middle of the old stone kitchen and listened to the fire pop and breathe inside the stove. She listened to the distance between herself and that retreating figure, and she let herself feel, for just one moment, The full strangeness of this day, the contempt and the laughter in the ruined room, and that first bowl of soup and Tumps Greer's nod and Caroline's line and those women on the path and this man who had walked into a forgotten building and spoken to her like she was worth the words. Then she turned back to the stove. She had an evening meal to finish. Because whatever else this place was, whatever else was happening in these walls and between these people, Margaret Ellis had made herself a promise. Not a grand one. Not the kind you announce, just the quiet bedrock kind. The kind that doesn't need an audience. She was going to make this kitchen sing. And every person who had laughed, every person who had looked at her body and decided they already knew the whole story was going to eat the food that came out of this room and feel, whether they understood why or not, what it meant to be cared for. That was her answer. That had always been her answer. She picked up her ladle and got back to work. The evening meal went out at 6 o'clock exactly. Beef and bean stew. She had found a small cache of dried beef at the very back of the root cellar, vacuum-packed in the old way, still sound. And she had soaked it and cooked it slowly all afternoon until it was tender with cornbread hot from the stove and stewed tomatoes on the side. 30 men, every bowl filled. Tom Greer found her after, when she was starting the night cleanup. "Miss Ellis," he said. "Mr. Greer." He held his hat in his hands again, the same way he had that morning. "I just wanted to say." He stopped, seemed to decide something. "We've been at Hawthorne 2-3 years, some of us. We've had good seasons and bad. This is the first time." He stopped again. Margaret waited. "It's the first time anybody thought to put tomatoes on the side," he said finally. "That's all. I just wanted to say that." Margaret looked at him. The honesty of it, the plainness of it, this man standing in the doorway of the worst kitchen on the property talking about tomatoes moved her in a way she hadn't expected. "Thank you, Tom," she said. He nodded, put his hat back on his head, and walked out into the evening. Margaret stood alone in the kitchen she had inherited that morning, the ruined, forgotten, humiliating kitchen that they had sent her to because they expected her to fail in it, and she looked at the fire in the stove, which was burning clean and steady, and she felt something she hadn't felt since before her father died. She felt against every odd this day had put against her, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She did not yet know what was coming. She did not know about the winter. She did not know about the storm, or what would be found in the estate records, or what Caroline Whitaker was carrying under that polished surface, or what Nathaniel Hawthorne had stopped trusting himself to believe in after his wife was gone. She just knew that the fire was drawing, and the food had gone out hot, and 30 men had eaten well. For tonight, that was enough. Tomorrow she would build on it. And every day after that, she would build on it again. That was how Margaret Ellis had always survived, not by demanding to be seen, not by asking anyone's permission to matter, by working, by feeding, by refusing. With every meal she cooked, and every fire she built, and every cold morning, she got up before the sun to do it all again, refusing to be less than what she was. The old kitchen breathed around her, the stone walls still holding the warmth of the day's fire, and Margaret picked up her broom and finished sweeping the floor. Tomorrow was coming. She intended to be ready for it. The morning after Margaret's first full day at Hawthorne Estate began the way every good story about survival begins, not with triumph, but with the quiet, stubborn act of getting up and doing it all over again. She was at the stove by 4:15. The fire she had banked the night before still held enough heat to catch quickly, and she fed it carefully, the way her mother had taught her, building it from the bottom up so it would burn steady and long rather than hot and fast and gone. While the water heated, she worked through her morning counts: flour, salt, the preserved stores from the root cellar, the dried beans she had set to soak overnight in the one large pot that wasn't cracked down the side. Tom Greer appeared at the door at 5 o'clock exactly, which was 15 minutes earlier than he'd come the day before, and he had 2 men with him instead of 1. "Thought you might need more water hauled," he said. "I do," Margaret said. "Thank you, Tom." He nodded and put his men to work. and Margaret noticed that he stayed himself rather than sending them back alone. He moved around the room with the careful awareness of someone who had decided, quietly and without announcement, that this particular corner of the estate was now somewhere he paid attention to. She didn't comment on it. Some things you acknowledge by letting them stand. By the time breakfast went out, she had added something she hadn't managed the morning before: a pot of oatmeal alongside the bean soup, sweetened with a small amount of molasses she'd found, sealed in a tin at the very back of the cabinet. And she had stretched it carefully so every man got a full portion. She sent the cornbread out again, but this time she had added dried sage to the top crust, crumbled fine, and the smell of it moving through the yard brought 3 men to the kitchen door who hadn't been there before, just to see what was happening. Word got out, Tom told her, with a satisfaction in his voice that he wasn't bothering to conceal. Word about what? Margaret asked, though she knew. That the back kitchen's got a real cook in it now. He paused. We've got men coming in from the East Field this week. About 8 more. They'll need to eat too. How many total? 38 by Friday. Margaret did the arithmetic in her head against what she had in her stores. It was tight. It was going to be tight for a while. But tight was not impossible, and impossible was the only thing that actually stopped her. They'll eat, she said. Tom Greer looked at her for a moment with something that was starting to resemble genuine respect. Yes, ma'am, he said. I reckon they will. But the morning wasn't done with her yet. She was deep in planning. She had her request list for Caroline written out in her neatest hand, itemized with the exact quantities and reasons for each, so precise and organized that there was no reasonable argument against it when the door to the old kitchen swung open and in walked a woman Margaret hadn't seen before. She was around Margaret's age, maybe a few years older, with a sharp face and work-reddened hands and the look of someone who had been managing a heavy load for long enough that she'd started to wear it like it was part of her body. She stopped just inside the door and looked at Margaret the way people look when they're not sure yet whether to be cautious or relieved. You're the new cook, the woman said. Margaret Ellis. Ruth Haynes. I run the laundry. She glanced around the room, and something in her expression softened almost imperceptibly when she saw the swept floor, the ordered shelves, the fire burning clean. I heard the men talking this morning. About the food. Were they complaining? Margaret asked. Ruth gave her a look. That was the closest thing to a laugh she seemed to allow herself. No, they were not complaining. She hesitated. I just wanted to come see for myself. Who you were. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and faced her squarely. Now you know. I suppose I do. Ruth's eyes moved back to her face, measuring something that had nothing to do with size or appearance. Miss Whitaker tell you how things work here? She told me some things. Did she tell you that the last 3 people in this kitchen lasted less than a month each? Margaret went still. She did not. First one left because the conditions were impossible. Second one because he couldn't get supplies approved fast enough to feed 30 men on a schedule. Third one, Ruth paused and pressed her lips together. Third one was a woman. She lasted 11 days. Miss Whitaker found reasons to dock her pay until it wasn't worth staying. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment except for the sound of the fire. Margaret turned back to her stove. She picked up her wooden spoon and stirred the pot that didn't need stirring. She was processing what Ruth had just told her, arranging it against everything she already knew, feeling it settle into the picture she'd been building since yesterday morning. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Ruth was quiet for a beat. Then, because you're the first one I've seen in that room who looked like you belonged there. She said it bluntly, without warmth, as if warmth would have made it less true. And I'd rather see you stay than watch another good person get pushed out. Margaret looked at her over her shoulder. I'm not leaving. Ruth studied her face for a moment. Then she nodded, once the same kind of nod Tom Greer had given her, that plain, unadorned signal that meant something had been understood between people who didn't waste words. All right, then, Ruth said, and walked back out. Margaret stirred the pot again, and this time it was because it needed stirring, because her hands needed something to do while she thought. 3 people before her. All of them pushed out. Caroline Whitaker had been doing this deliberately, sending people to this kitchen, not to manage the workers' meals, but to fail at managing them, to give her a reason to let them go. To keep this corner of the estate understaffed and undervalued so no one would look too hard at it. The question was why. The answer to that question was going to matter eventually. She could feel that with the particular instinct she'd developed growing up, watching her father navigate situations where the visible problem was never the real one. But right now, she had 38 men to feed by Friday, and she had a supply request to get approved, and she had a kitchen to run. So she ran it. By the end of the first week, something had changed at Hawthorne Estate, and the change was quiet enough that most people hadn't noticed it yet, but it was there. Building under the surface, the way a river builds under ice in early spring. The men who came to the old stone kitchen ate differently than men who expected nothing. They sat down, they talked, they took their time when they had it. A farmhand named Jesse, who was 18 and homesick in a way he didn't know how to say, but that Margaret could read in the way he pushed food around his plate, started coming early on Tuesday mornings and sitting on the step outside the kitchen door while Margaret worked. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. "You remind me of my ma," he told her one morning, unprompted, into the quiet. "Is that right?" Margaret said, not stopping her work. "She cooks like you, like she means it." He was quiet a moment. "She always said you could taste the difference between food that was made with care and food that was just made." Margaret thought about her mother, who had lived by that exact belief and passed it to her like a sacred text. "Your mother sounds like a smart woman." "Yes, ma'am." Jesse picked at a splinter on the doorframe. "I reckon she is." He started helping her carry wood in after that, without being asked, before every morning shift. Margaret didn't make a thing of it. She just made sure his bowl was always a little fuller than it needed to be. But the warmth building in the old kitchen was about to run directly into something cold. On Thursday of the second week, Caroline Whitaker appeared in the kitchen doorway during the noon meal preparation, and she was not alone. She had with her a man Margaret hadn't seen before, narrow-shouldered, with a ledger under one arm and eyes that moved over everything in the room with quick, adding up precision. The way a man's eyes move when he's been sent to find something worth finding. "This is Mr. Aldrin," Caroline said. "He manages accounts for the estate. He's doing a review of all departmental expenses." "Of course," Margaret said, keeping her hands moving, not stopping her work. "Happy to help any way I can." Mr. Aldrin opened his ledger. "You've been here 11 days. That's right. In that time you've drawn from the estate store's flour, dried beans, preserved goods from the root cellar, salt, molasses, dried beef." He read from the ledger without looking up. "The quantity of goods drawn is significantly higher than the previous 3 months combined." The room was very still. Margaret set down her spoon and turned to face him fully. "Yes," she said, "it is. Can you explain that?" "Easily." She crossed to her own records. She had been keeping them herself, in a notebook she'd bought with her own money in town before arriving, because she'd known from the moment she saw this kitchen that records were going to matter. She opened it to the second page and laid it on the table between them. "The stores I drew from in the root cellar had been sealed and left. 3 of the flour barrels had been left open and were going to mold within the week. The dried beef was from a stock that had been packed and forgotten. I've got the original pack date noted there, and the date I used it. What you're seeing in those numbers isn't excess. It's recovery of food that was already going to be lost." Mr. Aldrin looked at the notebook. His eyes moved down the columns. "Additionally," Margaret continued, her voice steady, "I've been feeding 35 to 38 men per day for 11 days. In the 3 months before my arrival, According to the supply logs which I found here in this kitchen, when I arrived, this kitchen was receiving deliveries sufficient for 22 men at most. Which means the men were being underfed, and the question of where those extra provisions went is one your ledger should be asking. The silence in the kitchen was of a different quality now. Caroline Whitaker's face had not moved, but something behind it had. Mr. Aldrin looked at Margaret. He looked at the notebook. He looked at Caroline. Then he wrote something in his ledger, closed it, and said, in a careful, neutral voice, "I'll need to take this notebook for review." "You're welcome to review it," Margaret said, "but I'll need it back, and I'll need a receipt for it." He blinked. Nobody had asked him for a receipt before. That was plain. "I can write one," he said. "Thank you." He wrote it. He took the notebook. He and Caroline left. Margaret stood in her kitchen and listened to the sound of her own breathing, slow and controlled, and then she picked up her spoon and went back to the pot. Tom Greer had witnessed the entire exchange from the doorway, where he'd appeared about 2 minutes in, and stayed without announcing himself. Now he stepped fully inside and said, "Where did you learn to do that?" "Do what?" That, he gestured vaguely in the direction Caroline and Mr. Aldrin had gone. "Keep accounts like that. Know what questions were going to get asked before they got asked." Margaret thought about her father and the warehouse job and the years of watching a man who worked hard and honest get cheated by people who controlled the paperwork. She thought about how she'd promised herself, the year her father died, that she was never going to be on the wrong side of a ledger again, just because nobody had taught her how the ledger worked. "I learned it," she said simply. "Same as everything else." Tom looked at her a long moment. "You're going to be fine here," he said. "I mean that." "I know," she said, and she meant it. That evening, after the meal went out and the kitchen was clean and the fire was banked, Margaret sat at her workbench with a spare sheet of paper and started writing down every discrepancy she had noticed in the supply records that had been left in this kitchen. Not because she knew yet what she was going to do with the information, but because her father had taught her that the truth was most useful when you had it written down in your own hand, before someone else had a chance to write their version of it first. She was halfway through the second page when she heard the door. She looked up. Nathaniel Hawthorne stood in the doorway. He didn't have a hat to hold this time, and he was dressed as plainly as before, with the look of a man who had come somewhere specific after making a deliberate decision to do so. "Miss Ellis," he said. "Mr. Hawthorne." He looked at the papers on her table. "Working late. There's always more to do than hours to do it in," she said. "Sit down if you like." He came in and sat on the bench across from her table, which was not something she had expected, but she was learning that Nathaniel Hawthorne operated with a different set of expectations than the ones she'd been handed about men who owned estates. "Mr. Aldrin came to see me this evening," he said. "I thought he might. He showed me your notebook." Nathaniel paused. "He told me the questions you asked him." Margaret set her pen down and waited. "He also told me," Nathaniel continued, "that you were right about the provisions. He cross-checked 3 of your claims against the original supply manifests. The numbers match." He looked at her steadily. "The estate has been losing food to waste and mismanagement for at least 2 years. That's what his preliminary review indicates." Margaret said nothing. "You knew that before he came to audit you," Nathaniel said. "It wasn't a question. I suspected it," she said. "I didn't know the full scope." "How did you know to suspect it?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because," she said finally, "when something's been neglected for a long time, you can see the pattern of the neglect. You can see which decisions were made out of carelessness and which ones were made on purpose. The root cellar wasn't forgotten by accident. Somebody decided it wasn't worth managing." Nathaniel was very quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "My wife managed this estate," he said. "She managed it extremely well for 8 years. When she died 18 months ago, I gave over most of the daily management to Miss Whitaker. He stopped. I should have been more present. Margaret looked at him. This was more than she had expected him to say, and she could see in the way he said it that it cost him something. I'm sorry about your wife, sir, she said. He nodded once, the way people nod when they've heard the phrase before, but can't quite close the door on it yet. I want to understand what's been happening here, he said. With the records, with the stores, he met her eyes. I'd like your help. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. At the steadiness in his face. At the way he was asking her, not ordering, not assuming, asking. All right, she said. Then I'll help. She turned back to her papers. And Nathaniel Hawthorne, owner of Hawthorne Estate, pulled the bench slightly closer to the table and looked at what she'd been writing. And the two of them sat together in the old forgotten kitchen by the light of a single lantern while the rest of the estate slept. Margaret talked through what she'd found. He listened the way people listen when they're genuinely trying to understand something rather than waiting for their turn to speak. He asked questions that were sharp and specific and showed her that whatever else grief had done to him in the past 18 months, it hadn't made him slow. At one point, he picked up the list she'd been making and read it through without speaking, and his jaw tightened, and then he set it down very carefully. This is significant, he said. Yes, sir. Who else knows what's in these records? Tom Greer knows some of it. Ruth Haynes suspects something isn't right, though I don't think she knows the details. Margaret paused. And Miss Whitaker knows that I know. Nathaniel looked up at her. Is that why she sent Mr. Aldrin to you? I believe so. Yes. He was quiet. She may have been trying to get ahead of it. Find a reason to question your competence before you could document hers. That's what I thought too. He set the paper down and looked at her across the table with the expression of a man who has just found something he didn't expect in a place he thought he already understood. You're not frightened, he said. You should be. She has considerably more authority here than you do. Margaret met his eyes. I know that, she said. But authority isn't the same as being right, and being right has a way of mattering eventually if you're patient enough to wait for it. Nathaniel Hawthorne looked at her for a long moment. My wife used to say something like that, he said quietly. Margaret didn't answer. She just picked up her pen and kept writing. Outside, the estate was dark and still, and the fire in the old kitchen had settled into its long, steady burn, the kind that would hold through the night and be ready to catch in the morning without needing to be rebuilt from nothing. The kind that came from being built right in the first place. That was the second week. The third week, everything shifted again. Jesse came to the kitchen door on a Monday morning with blood on his sleeve and a look on his face that was trying very hard to be something other than frightened. Margaret took one look at him and said, "Sit down." "It's not mine," he said quickly. "The blood. It's Frank Tilden fell off the grain cart yesterday evening. He's in the bunkhouse. The doc came out, but he's saying Frank needs to stay off his feet for a while, and—" Jesse stopped, and Margaret could see him working up to whatever he'd come to say. "And the men are worried. Frank's been sending money home to his family. If he can't work, there's no pay. And Miss Whitaker's already been around this morning, asking about who's not at their station." Margaret was already reaching for the pot she kept for broth. "What does Frank need?" "Food mostly. The doc said light food, easy on the stomach." "Soup." Jesse's voice cracked slightly on that last word in a way he immediately tried to cover by clearing his throat. "Go back to the bunkhouse," Margaret said. "Tell Frank I'll have broth and bread to him by 8 o'clock. And tell him." She paused, thinking of what her mother used to say to her father when the warehouse work had knocked him flat. "Tell him that missing one day doesn't make you a man who can't work. It makes you a man who got hurt. There's a difference." Jesse's face did something complicated. He swallowed. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and left fast, the way young men leave when they've gotten close to feeling something they're not sure what to do with yet. Margaret made the broth. She made it the right way. Bones simmered long, with onion and sage, strained clear, the fat skimmed off, The kind of broth that was almost medicinal in its plainness and almost impossible not to want when your body needed something gentle. She packed it in a covered pail with 2 slices of cornbread wrapped in cloth to keep the warmth, and she sent Tom with it to the bunkhouse. Tom came back an hour later and said, "The whole bunkhouse is talking about it." "About the broth?" Margaret said, not stopping her midday prep. "About the fact that somebody thought to send it." He leaned against the doorframe. "In 8 years working this estate, Miss Ellis, nobody from the house or the kitchen staff, has sent anything to a man laid up in the bunkhouse. They're used to being invisible when they're not useful." Margaret kept her hands moving, but something in her chest tightened and then released, like a fist slowly opening. "Nobody's invisible," she said. "They just get treated that way." "It's not the same thing." Tom Greer said nothing for a moment. Then, "No," he said. "I reckon it ain't." That afternoon, Caroline Whitaker came to the kitchen for the 3rd time, and this time she was not accompanied by an accountant or a smile. She came in and she stood in the middle of Margaret's kitchen, and she looked at the covered pails, the organized shelves, the fire, the records on the table, all of it. And something in her face was different from the careful performance of authority Margaret had seen before. Under the surface of it was something that looked, if Margaret was reading it right, almost like exhaustion. "The men are talking about you," Caroline said. "I've heard that," Margaret said. "They're saying you went around proper channels to send food to the Tilden man." Margaret looked up from her work. "I sent broth and bread to a sick man." "There's no channel for that because no one had ever thought to do it before. If there's a channel you'd like to establish, I'll use it going forward." Caroline looked at her. The performance was wearing thin at the edges, and Margaret could see it. "Why are you doing this?" Caroline said. And the way she said it was different, not the sharp, strategic way she'd said everything else, but a genuine question with a genuine tiredness underneath it. Margaret set down her spoon. She looked at Caroline Whitaker, who was carrying something heavy, had been carrying it a long time, and was starting to bend under it. "Because it's worth doing," Margaret said. "That's all." Caroline pressed her lips together. She looked at a point somewhere past Margaret's shoulder. Then she said, in a different voice than any she had used before, "The estate is in worse shape than anyone knows. I've been trying to hold it together since Mrs. Hawthorne died, and I don't have." She stopped. "I don't have the resources I need. I've been making decisions I shouldn't have been making alone." The kitchen was very quiet. "I know," Margaret said. Caroline looked at her. "How much do you know?" "Enough to understand that you were trying to keep something from falling apart," Margaret said carefully. "And that some of the ways you tried to do that caused harm." "Both things can be true at the same time." Caroline Whitaker looked at her for a long, unreadable moment. Then she turned and walked out, and she didn't slam the door, which told Margaret something significant. A woman acting from pure malice slams the door. A woman who's been reached closes it quietly. Margaret stood in the kitchen and breathed. She had not won anything yet. She knew that. This was not the moment where everything resolved. This was the moment where the situation became visible, in its full complexity, where the people in it began to show their actual shapes rather than the shapes they had been performing. The winter was coming. She could feel it in the way the mornings were changing, the quality of the cold, the way the farmhands wore their coats earlier each day. She had spent the last 3 weeks learning this kitchen, these people, these stores. She had been counting and planning and watching the supply levels against her projections. What she saw in those projections was not comfortable. She went back to her table that night and pulled out her paper, and she started writing a different kind of list. Not what had been lost to waste, what was left, what would be needed. How many mouths? How many weeks before the roads could ice over and cut the estate off from town? The numbers were not good. The numbers, in fact, were frightening. But Margaret Ellis had looked frightening numbers in the face before. She had fed a family of 6 on almost nothing in the dead of winter, and she had done it because her mother had taught her that resourcefulness was not a talent you were born with, but a practice you built, day by day. Refusal by refusal, from the simple act of choosing not to give up. She wrote the numbers down, all of them, clearly, so that when the time came to show them to Nathaniel Hawthorne, there would be no confusion about what they meant and no room for anyone to say she hadn't seen it coming. Because she had seen it coming. She had seen it from the first morning she'd stood in this kitchen and taken inventory of what it had been left with. And she had been working toward the moment when seeing it would not be enough, when someone with the authority to act would have to be shown what she had already known. That moment was almost here. She finished her list, folded it, and tucked it inside the cover of her records notebook. Then she banked the fire and went to bed. Outside, the wind was coming from the north, and it had a new edge to it, and the trees around the old stone kitchen moved together with a sound like something urgent being said in a language just beyond the edge of understanding. Margaret heard it, she understood it, and she was not afraid. The cold came faster than anyone had predicted. Margaret felt it the morning she walked to the root cellar before sunrise, and her breath came out in a long white cloud that didn't dissolve it, just hung there in the dark air, like a warning written in a language. Everyone understood, but nobody wanted to read first. The ground underfoot had that particular hardness that meant the freeze had gone deeper than the surface. She stood at the cellar door for a moment and did the math in her head, the same math she'd been doing every morning for 2 weeks. And the numbers came out the same way they always did. Not enough. Not yet enough. She went inside and started the fire. By the time Tom Greer appeared at the door, she had already pulled her notebook and was going through the columns for the 4th time that week, looking for anything she might have calculated wrong. Any place where the numbers could be made to yield something better than what they were showing her. Tom took one look at her face and said, "How bad?" She looked up. She had stopped being surprised that he could read her that accurately. Some people, she had learned, paid attention as a form of loyalty. "Bad enough," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She turned the notebook toward him and let him look at the columns while she talked through it the projected consumption rate against the current stores. The estimated weeks before the northern road closed, based on what the farmhands who'd been at Hawthorne longest were telling her about how the seasons ran here. The items that were already critically low versus the items that could stretch if she managed them carefully. Tom was quiet for a long time after she finished. "You need to show this to Mr. Hawthorne," he said. "I know. Today, Margaret." She heard the first name in his voice and understood what it meant. Tom Greer was not a man who used first names casually. He was not a man who said things with more urgency than the situation called for. When he dropped the formality, it was because the formality had become a luxury the moment couldn't afford. "I'll go this morning," she said, "after the meal goes out." "Before," he said, "let the men wait 20 minutes for once. This is more important." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the steady, unbothered certainty of someone who has already thought the argument through and arrived at an answer he's comfortable with. She closed the notebook. "All right," she said. "Before." She found Nathaniel Hawthorne in his study on the east side of the main house, which was the first time she had been inside the main house beyond the service entrance, and she registered the difference without letting it distract her. The housekeeper who answered the door tried to redirect her to the back entrance, and Margaret said, politely and clearly, "I need to speak with Mr. Hawthorne directly on an urgent matter regarding the estate's winter provisions. Please tell him Margaret Ellis is here." The housekeeper looked at her the way people look when they're weighing whether a person's confidence matches their authority. Margaret held the look steadily and be weighed. Nathaniel appeared at the study door himself before the housekeeper made her decision. He took one look at Margaret's face and stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. She laid the notebook on his desk without preamble and talked him through it the same way she had talked Tom through it. Point by point, column by column. No softening and no alarm. just the facts in the order they mattered. She watched his face as she talked, and she saw the moment when he understood not just intellectually, but fully, in the way understanding lands when it has weight behind it. He sat back in his chair and was quiet. "How long have you known this?" he asked. "I've been tracking the numbers since my second week. I wanted to be certain before I brought it to you." She paused. "I'm certain. 2 years of poor management," he said, more to himself than to her. "The provisions we should have accumulated over the summer were partially used up and partially lost to spoilage," Margaret said. "The cellar records show a significant decline in preservation activity over the last 18 months. Since Mrs. Hawthorne passed." The words landed quietly between them. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, just slightly, and then released. "What do we need?" he said. "More than we can get easily," she said honestly. "The northern road is already unreliable. We have perhaps a 2-week window, maybe 3 if the weather holds, to bring in what we're missing. After that, we work with what we have." She met his eyes. "If you authorize the purchases and the transport, I can tell you exactly what to buy, in what quantities, and how to store it to last the winter. Every person on this estate." Nathaniel Hawthorne looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Write the list." "I already have it," she said, and turned to the back page of the notebook. He read it through. He asked 2 questions, both of them sharp, practical questions about specific items and her reasoning, and she answered them directly. He nodded. "I'll authorize it today," he said. "Tom Greer can take the wagon into town starting tomorrow morning." "He'll need 2 wagons," Margaret said, "and 4 men who know how to stack and cover a load so it doesn't shift on a frozen road." Nathaniel looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite a smile, but the thing that exists before a smile, the decision to let something in. "2 wagons," he said. "I'll arrange it." She picked up her notebook. "Thank you, sir, Miss Ellis." His voice stopped her at the door. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize, the one where he was saying something he hadn't planned to say, something the moment pulled out of him before his careful reserve could catch it. "I should have been doing this," he said. "The counting. The planning. I gave that over and I shouldn't have." Margaret held his gaze. "You're doing it now," she said. "That's what matters." She went back to her kitchen, started the morning meal, and the men ate 40 minutes later than usual, and not one of them complained. The wagons went out the next morning at first light. Margaret spent the 2 days they were gone, doing the most thorough inventory of the estate's food situation she had done yet, not just the old kitchen and the root cellar, but the main kitchen stores, the curing shed, the ice house. Every place where something edible might be kept or hidden or forgotten. She brought Ruth Haynes in to help her with the parts of the main house she didn't have access to yet, and Ruth navigated those spaces with an efficiency that told Margaret she'd been watching this operation carefully for a long time. What they found in the curing shed was what pushed Margaret from concerned to genuinely alarmed. Ruth picked up one of the salt-packed meat barrels and put it back down and said, in a flat, controlled voice that Margaret had learned to recognize as Ruth's version of deeply upset, "This is wrong." "What's wrong?" "The weight." Ruth tapped the barrel. "It should be heavier by a lot." Margaret picked up the same barrel. Ruth was right. It was light in a way that made no sense for a barrel that should have been packed full in September. She pried the lid up with the tool hanging on the wall beside the shelf. The barrel was less than half full. She checked the next one. The same. She checked all 7 barrels in the row, and 5 of them were significantly underfilled relative to what the labels said they contained. Labels written in a hand she didn't recognize, with dates from 2 months ago. She and Ruth looked at each other across the shed. "The records," Margaret said quietly, "in the main kitchen. Are they kept by Miss Whitaker or by the kitchen staff?" Ruth pressed her lips together. "Miss Whitaker keeps the supply ledger herself. Has since Mrs. Hawthorne passed." The full shape of what had been happening at Hawthorne Estate assembled itself in Margaret's mind with the terrible clarity of something that had always been there, waiting to be seen by someone willing to look directly at it. The missing provisions were not just a management failure. Someone had been taking from these stores systematically and recording them as full. Ruth, Margaret said carefully, "I need you to say nothing about this to anyone yet." "Not until I talk to Mr. Hawthorne." Ruth's face had gone very still. "Margaret, I know. If she finds out you found this before you can get to him." "I know." Margaret put the lid back on the barrel, replaced it exactly as it had been. "That's why I need to move fast and say nothing. Can you do that?" Ruth looked at her for a long, taut moment. "Yes," she said. "I can do that." They finished the inventory. They went back to their separate buildings. And Margaret went directly to her workbench and wrote down every barrel number, every weight discrepancy, every label date, every detail she could recall with the clarity she had trained herself to have precisely because situations like this one eventually arrived, always when you were least prepared to be surprised. The wagons came back on the third day, loaded with everything she had asked for, and a little more. Because Tom Greer had the particular gift of men who take a practical task seriously, he had judged, at the market in town, what was quality and what wasn't, and he had chosen well. But before she could feel any relief at the sight of those wagons, something else arrived first. A rider. He came from the South Road at a pace that said he was not making a social call. He went directly to the main house, and Margaret watched from the kitchen door as he handed an envelope to the housekeeper and rode back the way he had come without dismounting. She went back to her work. An hour later, Nathaniel appeared at the kitchen door, and his face was different than it had been 2 days ago. Not different the way grief makes a face different, or even worry. Different the way a face looks when a man has just understood that the ground he was standing on was not what he thought it was. "May I come in?" he said. "You don't have to ask," she said. "Sit down." He came in and sat, and he had the envelope in his hand, and he set it on the table between them but didn't push it toward her. He looked at it for a moment, like a man deciding something. Then he said, "There's a man in Lexington named Hartwell. He's a creditor. The letter is from his representative." He paused. "He's claiming that Hawthorne Estate has defaulted on payments that I did not know existed." Margaret went very still. "Payments," she said. "Loans taken against the estate's assets." Nathaniel's voice was steady, but the steadiness was the effortful kind, the kind you produce because the alternative is something you're not going to allow yourself. "Taken over the last 14 months. In amounts that total—" He stopped. He pressed his hand flat on the table. "That total enough to threaten the estate's solvency, if they're not addressed." "Who took the loans?" Margaret said, though part of her already knew. "The signature on the documents is mine," he said. "But I did not sign them." The kitchen was absolutely silent. Margaret looked at the envelope. She thought about the half-filled barrels with their false labels. She thought about the supply ledger Caroline kept herself. She thought about the accountant with his careful eyes who had come to audit Margaret's kitchen while the main operation was apparently hemorrhaging from a wound nobody had been meant to find. She picked up her own notebook and turned to the inventory page she had written the night before, the barrel numbers, the weight discrepancies, the label dates in the unfamiliar hand. She turned it to face Nathaniel. He read it. His eyes moved down the page slowly, and she watched the understanding build in his face like weather. When he looked up at her, something in his expression had shifted completely. "How long have you known about this?" he said. "I found the barrels 2 days ago," she said. "I was waiting for the right moment to tell you, and making sure I had the details exactly right before I did." He looked at her. "And you're sure of these numbers?" "I am, Margaret." He said her name the way a man says a name when he needs an anchor. "What I'm looking at in this letter, if someone has been taking assets from this estate and recording false supplies and forging my signature on loan documents, this is not mismanagement." "No," she said quietly, "it isn't. This is something I need a lawyer for." "Yes, and I need these records." He touched the edge of her notebook. Your records. They're yours, she said. I made copies last night. For both of us. He looked at her for a long moment, and in his face was something she didn't quite have a name for. It was beyond gratitude. It was beyond respect. It was the look of a man who has been alone in something frightening, and has just discovered he is not, in fact, alone. Why did you make copies? He said. Because, Margaret said, I've seen what happens when only one person holds the evidence. I wasn't going to let that happen here. Nathaniel Hawthorne pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed out slowly. Then he said, I need to speak with Caroline, I know. Do you want to be there? Margaret thought about it for only a moment. Yes, she said. I do. They went to Caroline Whitaker's office together, Margaret and Nathaniel, walking side by side through the main house for the first time, which was not something Margaret had imagined when she'd arrived on that wagon 6 weeks ago. And she registered the strangeness of it without letting it pull her off center. Caroline was at her desk when they came in. She looked up, and in the single second between seeing them and composing her face, Margaret saw it, the flash of something that was not surprise. It was recognition. The recognition of a person who has been running a long time and has just heard the sound of the thing that's been chasing them finally come around the corner. Nathaniel set the letter on her desk. He set Margaret's inventory page beside it. He said nothing for a moment, which was a choice. Margaret understood it as a choice, because Nathaniel Hawthorne was the kind of man who understood that silence put the weight exactly where it belonged. Caroline looked at the documents. Her hands were folded on the desk, and they did not tremble, which told Margaret something about who Caroline Whitaker had been, before whatever had happened to make her the woman she was now. I can explain, Caroline said. I'd like you to, Nathaniel said. And Caroline Whitaker looked at the letter, and at Margaret's inventory, and at Nathaniel Hawthorne standing with his arms at his sides and his face giving nothing away, and then she looked at Margaret. Not with hostility, not with the calculated dismissal that had been the language of their first weeks together. She looked at Margaret with the exhausted, stripped-down look of a person who has just been too tired to perform anymore. I made mistakes, she said. I made them because I didn't know what else to do. After Mrs. Hawthorne died, there were debts, old debts, from before you came back from the East, Nathaniel, debts that Eleanor had managed quietly and never told you about. I found them in her papers, and I was afraid of what they meant. I was afraid of what would happen to this estate, to all the people on it, if you found out and couldn't manage them. Nathaniel's face did not move, so you took loans in my name. I thought I could pay them back before anyone noticed. The provisions I sold some of what we had surplus to cover interest payments. I kept the records the way I did because she stopped. Because you needed the books to look whole, Margaret said quietly. Caroline looked at her. Yes, the room held the silence of a complicated truth being told for the first time, and it was not a comfortable silence, but it was a necessary one. Nathaniel pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform anger, even though Margaret could see in the set of his shoulders that he had the right to it. He said, Caroline, whatever Eleanor managed quietly, whatever the original debts were, you should have told me. Caroline's composure broke in one single, clean motion, the way ice breaks on a river all at once, and then it's done. She pressed her hand to her mouth and breathed hard through her nose, and then pulled herself back together with visible effort. I know, she said. I know I should have. I was trying to protect what she built. I was trying to protect you from more pain. She looked at the table. I told myself it was for the estate. But honestly, I was terrified. And I made it worse. Every choice I made to cover the last one made everything worse. Margaret stood beside the door and listened and felt the shape of this woman's decisions, the fear, the pride, the accumulation of small disasters, the way people who are carrying something alone will do almost anything rather than admit they can't hold it. She had seen it before, in her father, who had never told his family how bad things were at the warehouse until it was too late. In herself, in the years she had smiled and reduced herself and said she was fine. Fear of admitting you're struggling doesn't make you a villain. It makes you human, but it could still cause real damage, and this damage was real, and the reckoning was real, and feeling compassion for how someone had gotten there did not mean the consequences went away. Nathaniel looked at Margaret. She met his eyes and nodded once, barely. He turned back to Caroline. "Here is what happens now," he said. "We will get a lawyer. We will go through every document, every loan record, every supply ledger. What can be corrected, we will correct. What debt exists, we will address. And you will help us do that, completely, holding nothing back." He paused. "Can you do that?" Caroline was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes, I can do that." "Then that is where we start." He stood. He picked up the letter. He looked at Margaret one more time, and in his look was the shared weight of two people who had just watched something necessary and painful finally come to the surface. They walked back out of the office together. In the hallway, Margaret stopped and let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like the entire length of the conversation. Nathaniel stopped beside her. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes." She thought about it. "I think so." She paused. She was wrong. What she did was wrong, and it caused real harm to real people, and that has to be addressed. It will be. But she wasn't cruel, Margaret said. She was afraid, and she was alone, and she let that make her into something she probably never intended to be. She was quiet a moment. "I understand that more than I'd like to." Nathaniel looked at her with the particular attention of a man who is hearing something important and knows it. He said, "Is that why you didn't come to me the moment you found the barrels? Why you waited and gathered everything first?" Margaret considered the question honestly. "Partly," she said. "Partly it was strategy." And she stopped. "Partly I wanted to be certain I understood what I was seeing before I told you. Because I've seen what it costs someone when they're accused of something by someone who doesn't have the whole picture. I wasn't going to do that." Nathaniel Hawthorne looked at her for a long, still moment. "No," he said quietly. "I don't imagine you would." Outside, the wind had picked up, and through the hallway window, Margaret could see the trees moving in that insistent, urgent way that said the cold front the farmhands had been predicting was here now, ahead of schedule. And the supplies from Tom's wagons were still sitting in the yard, needing to be unloaded and stored and organized against the winter that was already walking through the gates of Hawthorne Estate. She turned toward the back door. "Miss Ellis," Nathaniel said. She turned. "I'm going to need that lawyer," he said. "And I'm going to need those records you kept." He paused, and something in his voice was different now, not the careful formality of an employer, not the careful distance of a grieving man, but something plainer and steadier than either. "And I'm going to need someone who knows this estate's real situation better than anyone else here does." Margaret looked at him. She knew what he was saying. Not all of it, not yet, but the part that mattered right now. "I'll be in the kitchen," she said. "Come when you're ready." She went back to the old stone kitchen, and she put on her apron, and she went out to direct the unloading of the wagons. And the cold came in hard off the north field, and the sky above the estate was the color of pewter, and the first small pellets of sleet hit the stone path under her feet while she worked. She barely felt them. There was too much to do, and the worst of it was still coming. The sleet that had started the night before turned to snow by morning, and the snow did not stop. Margaret was at the stove before 4 o'clock earlier than usual, because she had lain awake most of the night listening to the wind change direction twice and feeling in her bones what that meant. She had done her calculations before she slept. She had done them again when she woke. The numbers had not improved overnight the way you sometimes hope numbers will when you're tired and afraid and want to believe you missed something the first time. She had not missed anything. The storm was here, and it was serious, and Hawthorne Estate was going into it with less than she needed, and more mouths than anyone had properly counted. Tom Greer appeared at the door at 4:30, which was 30 minutes earlier than usual, And the look on his face when he came in from the cold told her everything about what the yard looked like without her needing to step outside. "The north road's already gone," he said. He knocked snow off his coat and came to stand by the stove, holding his hands out toward the heat. Johnson tried to get through at first light with the empty wagon. Made it about a quarter mile before the drift stopped him. "How deep?" Margaret asked, not stopping her work. "Axle deep in the low spots. Maybe worse further on," he paused. "We're not getting anything in or out. Not today. Maybe not for a while." "How long is a while?" Tom Greer had been working land in Kentucky for 20 years. When a man like that hesitated before answering a practical question, it meant the answer was the one you didn't want. "Last time we had a system come in off the north like this, the road was impassable for 11 days, he said. "Could be less. Could be more." Margaret finished stirring the pot. She set the spoon down and turned to face him directly. 38 men, she said, plus the household staff, Ruth, the housekeeper, the 2 kitchen girls, the laundry women. Caroline, Mr. Hawthorne. She had already counted them. She counted them again aloud now, so Tom could hear the number 2 and understand what it meant. 51 people. Tom looked at her. "I have provisions for 42, she said. "For 11 days, at the rationing level I worked out last night. I'm 8 people short if this goes to 11 days, and I have nothing in reserve if it goes longer." The fire crackled between them. Outside, the wind made a sound against the stone walls, like something leaning its full weight against the building, testing it. "What do you need?" Tom said. "I need every person on this estate to know right now what we're dealing with," Margaret said. "I need a full count, everyone here, no exceptions. I need access to every storage space on this property, including the ones in the main house that I haven't been through yet. And I need someone to tell Mr. Hawthorne before breakfast, not after." Tom was already pulling his coat back on. "I'll tell him myself," he said. "Right now, Tom," he stopped at the door. She looked at him steadily. "Tell him it's manageable, because it is. But tell him the truth about how manageable, because he needs to know the real shape of it." Tom nodded once and went out into the snow. Margaret turned back to the stove and thought very carefully, very deliberately, about every resource she had and how to use it. This was not a new kind of thinking for her. This was the same thinking she had done at 9 years old when her mother was sick and her father was at the warehouse, and it was her job to make 4 cups of flour and half a jar of beans into dinner for 6 people. The scale was different. The principle was the same. You worked with what you had. You wasted nothing. You made every decision on purpose rather than by habit. The first thing she did was send Jesse, who appeared at the kitchen door at 5 o'clock looking for his usual early morning seat on the step, directly to the bunkhouse with a message for every man to meet in the main yard at 7 o'clock. Then she sent one of the kitchen girls to find Ruth and another to wake the household staff. She did it quietly and without drama, because panic was the one thing she could not afford to put into the air right now. Panic made people stupid with their resources and selfish with their actions and blind to the cooperative solutions that were the only ones that worked when a situation like this one landed on 51 people at once. Nathaniel came to the kitchen at 5:30. He did not look like a man who had been sleeping when Tom found him. "Tom told me," he said. "Good." She handed him a cup of coffee, the real thing, not the chicory substitute she was already calculating she'd need to shift to in order to conserve and spread her inventory pages on the table. "Sit down and look at this with me." He sat, he looked. He asked the right questions, the same sharp, practical questions he had asked the first time she had laid her numbers before him, and she answered them the same way she always did, which was directly and without making them softer than they were. "We're short on meat," she said. "We have enough grain and preserved goods to manage if I shift the meal plan significantly. But the protein shortage is the real problem. The barrels Caroline underfilled. Are those the only ones affected? 5 of the 7 in the curing shed. I found 2 more in the main kitchen storage last week. 7 total that were recorded full and weren't." She paused. That's a significant percentage of our winter meat supply. Nathaniel pressed his hand flat on the table. It was a gesture she had come to recognize, the way he physically steadied himself against something that deserved to be upsetting, but that he was not going to allow to make him useless. "What can we do about it?" he said. "The icehouse has a deer that Johnson brought in last week. It's whole, and it's been cold enough to keep it good. I need permission to use it now, rather than later. You have it. I also need your permission to go through the main kitchen's full stores, including the locked cabinet behind the pantry that I've been told requires Miss Whitaker's authorization." Something shifted in his jaw. "You have that too," he said. "I'll get you the key myself. And I need to talk to the men this morning. All of them together. Not just the farmhands. Everyone." Nathaniel looked at her. "What do you want to say to them?" "The truth," she said. "That we have a situation, that it's manageable, that it requires everyone to work together and nobody to make individual decisions about food that haven't been cleared through this kitchen." She met his eyes. "People cooperate better when they understand the real situation. When they're kept in the dark, they hoard. When they know the truth, and they know someone's managing it with a plan, they follow the plan." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "You've done this before," he said. "Not exactly this." He stood. "I'll be in the yard at 7, he said. "You lead the meeting. I'll stand behind what you say." The significance of that Nathaniel Hawthorne, owner of this estate, telling the woman he had found in the most forgotten corner of his property that he would stand behind her words to his entire workforce, landed in Margaret's chest with a weight that she did not have time to fully feel right now. So she filed it away for later, for a quiet moment, and she said, "Thank you," and she went back to the stove. By 7 o'clock, 50 people were standing in the main yard in the snow. Margaret stood on the mounting block beside the stable, which put her slightly above the crowd, and she looked out at all of them, the farmhands and the stable workers and the laundry women and the kitchen girls and Ruth Haynes, with her arms crossed and her face steady, and Jesse shifting his weight in the back row with the particular restlessness of a young man trying to look calm, and she said loudly and clearly, "Good morning. Here's where we are," she told them. She gave them the numbers, not the frightening version, not the softened version, the accurate version. She told them how many days of provisions they had at normal consumption. She told them what the adjusted rationing looked like and what it meant for daily meals. She told them what she needed from each of them: no private food stores. All meals through the kitchen. Any physical task that could be done indoors should be done indoors until the storm broke. Anyone with a skill related to food preservation should come see her this morning. She watched their faces while she talked, watched the worry, the calculation, the different ways 50 people processed news that asked something of them. Some of them looked at her with the straightforward acceptance of people who are used to hard seasons and know that complaining doesn't warm anything. Some of them looked uncertain. One man, she didn't know his name yet, a newer hand from the East Field, crossed his arms and said, "Who put you in charge of deciding how much we eat?" The yard went very quiet. Margaret looked at him directly. "Mr. Hawthorne did," she said this morning. "You're welcome to take the question to him, and I'll be here working when you get back." Nathaniel, standing at the edge of the crowd, said, "She's right on both counts." The man uncrossed his arms. Margaret looked back at the group. "I know this is hard news. I know some of you had plans and expectations that this storm is going to interrupt. I'm not asking you to be happy about it. I'm asking you to trust that if everyone works this plan together, every single person standing in this yard will eat every day until that road opens." She paused. "I haven't let anyone go hungry yet. I don't intend to start now." Something moved through the crowd, not quite a sound, more like shift in the quality of the silence. The kind that comes when a group of people make a collective unspoken decision to believe someone. Tom Greer, standing at the front, said, "All right. You heard her. Let's get to work." And they did. The first 2 days of the storm were the hardest logistically. Margaret barely slept. She was up before 4 and in the kitchen past midnight, working through the full reimagining of the estate's food operation. She had moved herself, in effect, from running the workers' kitchen to running the entire estate's food supply. Which was not a small thing and not something she had the technical authorization to do, but which Nathaniel had made clear, in plain and direct language, that she was to do without waiting for anyone to make it official. She moved the main kitchen supplies into a single consolidated inventory. She worked out a unified meal schedule that covered all 51 people with 3 meals a day, reduced in size but not in quality. Because she had learned from her mother that food's job was not just to fill a body, but to keep a person's spirit from giving up. And a meal that tasted like deprivation said something to the people eating it that a meal made with care, even from modest ingredients, did not. Ruth Haynes turned out to be invaluable in a way Margaret hadn't fully understood until the storm made their collaboration necessary. Ruth knew the main house's storage spaces better than anyone, every cabinet, every shelf, every back corner where something might have been left and forgotten. She walked Margaret through the locked pantry with the key Nathaniel had produced, and together they found 3 things that changed the arithmetic meaningfully. A full barrel of dried corn that had been pushed to the very back of the lowest shelf, correctly sealed, still good. 2 crocks of lard sealed in the old way, with cloth and wax, which Margaret hadn't known about because they were behind a stack of empty baskets that had been sitting there long enough to collect a significant layer of dust. And a full tin box of salt, which was small but not nothing, because salt was the thing that let you stretch every other food you had. Ruth held up the lard crocks and said, with more satisfaction than her face usually admitted, "Eleanor Hawthorne put these up herself. 3 autumns ago. I remember 'cause she had me help her carry them down." Margaret looked at the crocks and felt, unexpectedly and strongly, the presence of a woman she had never met, a woman who had managed this estate for 8 years and had known. The way competent people always know, that preparation was not pessimism but love. That putting things up against hard times was a way of saying, "I care about the people who will need these." She was thorough, Margaret said. She was remarkable, Ruth said quietly. And Nathaniel, after she was gone, she stopped. He set the crocks down. He stopped being here, even when he was here. That's how Caroline ended up making decisions she had no business making alone. There was nobody else with the authority to stop her, and nobody with the will to look closely enough to see what was happening. Margaret picked up one of the lard crocks. It was solid and sealed and exactly what she needed. "He's back now," she said. Ruth looked at her for a moment, with an expression that was more than agreement. "Yes," she said, "he is." The 3rd day of the storm was when the real test came. Frank Tilden, the farmhand who had fallen from the grain cart 3 weeks earlier and who had been recovering steadily, woke up sick. Not the kind of sick that meant his ankle was bothering him again, but genuinely sick. Fever sick, the kind that moved fast and hit hard, especially in a man who had already been weakened. Jesse came to the kitchen at 5 in the morning, with a face that was trying very hard not to show how frightened he was and not quite succeeding. "It's bad, Miss Ellis," he said. "He's burning up." "The other men are scared." Margaret was already reaching for what she needed. Broth. She had it simmering, because she always had broth simmering now, the way you always have water ready when you're in a situation where you can't know what the next hour will ask of you. She added dried willow bark that she had found in a paper envelope in the back of the herb cabinet, labeled in a precise hand she was coming to recognize as Eleanor Hawthorne's. She added dried elderberry, which she knew worked on fevers from her mother's practice of it, and she stood over that pot and worked it with everything she had. "Go back and stay with him," she told Jesse. "Keep him as warm as you can. Don't let him throw his blankets off even if he wants to. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Jesse looked at her the way he looked at her sometimes, with a raw, uncomplicated gratitude that she never quite knew what to do with. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "She was there in 15. Frank Tilden was 34 years old, and he had the look of a man who had spent his life doing hard physical work and was unaccustomed to the particular powerlessness of a body that wouldn't do what he told it. He was in the bunk nearest the stove, and he was shaking in a way that the two wool blankets over him weren't addressing. And when Margaret walked in, every man in that bunkhouse was awake and watching from his bunk with the careful, controlled tension of people who know that watching is the only useful thing they can do right now. She sat beside Frank and got him to drink the broth and the herb preparation slowly, spoonful by spoonful, and she talked to him while he drank, not about his condition, not about the storm, just ordinary talk. The kind that said someone was here and steady and not afraid, because fear is contagious in a closed room and so is calm. And she had long ago decided which one she was going to be the source of. When she stood to leave, the man who had crossed his arms in the yard on the first morning was sitting on the edge of his bunk 6 feet away. His name, she had learned since, was Hatch. He looked at her with a different expression than the one he'd been wearing in the yard. "He's going to be all right?" Hatch said. "I think so," Margaret said honestly. "If we keep him warm and keep that preparation in him every few hours, I think so." "What do you need from us?" "Someone to sit with him through the day. Rotate every 2 hours so nobody misses a full shift of rest." She looked around the bunkhouse. "And I need someone to come to the kitchen this afternoon. I want to teach 3 or 4 of you the basics of managing a sick man's care, because I can't be in 2 places at once and the storm isn't finished." Hatch looked at the other men. He looked back at her. "I'll be there," he said. That afternoon, Margaret taught an impromptu lesson in the old stone kitchen to 4 farmhands who sat at her workbench like students at a schoolroom table, and wrote notes in the margins of whatever paper they had, the backs of letters, the inside covers of small notebooks about fever management and broth preparation, and when to be alarmed versus when to hold steady. She had never planned to do anything like this. But then, she hadn't planned most of what had happened to her in the last 6 weeks. And the unplanned things had turned out to be the ones that mattered most. Hatch, who turned out to have a careful, methodical mind that he kept hidden under his belligerent exterior, the way some people hide their best qualities to avoid the vulnerability of having them seen, asked the most questions. He also had the best handwriting of the 4, which Margaret mentioned, and he looked briefly startled and then quietly pleased, in the way people look when they've been seen accurately by someone they didn't expect to notice them. "My mother was a healer," he said, "back in Virginia." "I know a little." "Then you know more than most," Margaret said. "I could use your help." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man deciding something fundamental about someone. "All right," he said, "you've got it." By the 5th day of the storm, something was happening at Hawthorne Estate that Margaret couldn't have predicted and wouldn't have known how to engineer. Because it wasn't the kind of thing you engineer, it was the kind of thing that grows on its own, when the conditions are right. When the artificial distances between people get stripped away by necessity, and what's left is the plain fact of everyone needing the same things. The household staff and the farmhands were eating together. It had started practically there were only so many warm spaces, and the old stone kitchen, with its fire going all day, had become the natural gathering point for anyone with a spare hour. Which meant the laundry women and the kitchen girls, and 2 of the stable workers were all in the same room at the same time, which they had not been before, and they were eating Margaret's food together, and the food was good. And good food in a warm room with other people in it does something particular to a person's capacity for the usual divisions. Ruth Haynes sat at the same table as Tom Greer and 3 farmhands for the first time in what she told Margaret was the entire length of her employment at Hawthorne, which was 6 years. She said it like she was noting a fact. Margaret heard it like a small victory. Della, the young woman who had given Margaret that small, careful nod back on the first day, when the other women had laughed on the path, had started coming to the kitchen in the early mornings to help with prep. She hadn't asked. She had simply appeared one morning, rolled up her sleeves, and said, "Tell me what to do." Margaret had told her, and she had done it without complaint or fanfare. And she was quick and attentive and willing to learn, and Margaret found herself genuinely grateful for her in a way that snuck up on her. Caroline Whitaker was the most complicated development of the storm. She had been, since the confrontation in her office, visibly and genuinely changed, not in the dramatic, performative way that changes sometimes present themselves, but in the quieter, more durable way of someone who has had a reckoning and is living with it. She ate her meals in the kitchen with everyone else. She helped where she could. She was, it turned out, a capable hand at organizing, and Margaret put her to work on the supply ledgers, the real ones, the accurate ones, which was either a pointed choice or a practical one. And Margaret was honest enough with herself to acknowledge it was probably both. On the fifth evening, Caroline came to find Margaret after the dinner service and stood in the kitchen doorway until Margaret acknowledged her. "I owe you an apology," Caroline said. Margaret looked at her. "You've said that. I know. I want to say it more specifically this time." Caroline came in and stood at the workbench with her hands folded together, and for the first time since Margaret had met her, she looked her full age, not the managed, controlled age she usually presented, but the real age of a woman who had been carrying something too heavy for too long. "What I did to you when you arrived, putting you in this kitchen. The way I spoke to you, I told myself it was practical. That this was the appropriate place for a worker of your position." She paused. "That wasn't why." Margaret waited. "I saw you come off that wagon," Caroline said, "and I was afraid of you. Not of anything you'd done, but of what you were. Someone who was competent and caring and not willing to stay small." Her voice was steady, but it cost her something to keep it that way. "I've spent years making myself necessary here by controlling everything very tightly. And I could see in the first 5 minutes that you were not someone who was going to fit into a tight system the way I needed people to fit." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire spoke for a moment and then settled. Margaret said, "You were right about that." Something in Caroline's face loosened. "I know." She looked down at her folded hands. "I caused you real harm. The way I treated you in those first weeks, the supply denials, the audit, I was trying to undermine you before you could do what you obviously were going to do anyway." She looked up. "I'm sorry, genuinely." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. She thought about what she had said to Nathaniel in his study, that people can make terrible choices when they're carrying burdens alone. And that understanding how someone got to a choice doesn't excuse the choice, but it changes what the choice means. She had believed that when she said it. She believed it now. "I accept your apology," Margaret said, "and I want to say something to you, and I want you to hear it the way it's meant, which is plainly." Caroline nodded. "You're good at this," Margaret said. "At managing, at organizing, at the kind of systematic thinking that keeps a large operation running. You made terrible decisions when you were under pressure and alone and afraid, and those decisions did serious harm." "That's true." She held Caroline's eyes. "But the skill itself is real and it's needed here. And I'd rather have you working with me than have you working against me, because you're still scared." Caroline was very still. "That's the plainest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time," she said. "I expect it is," Margaret said. "I mean every word of it." Caroline pressed her lips together and nodded. Once. The same kind of nod Margaret had been collecting from people at Hawthorne Estate, the nod that meant something had been understood and accepted at the level below words. "Tell me what you need from me," Caroline said. "Tomorrow morning," Margaret said. "Come at 5. Bring the master ledger, the real one that Mr. Aldrin is working from. We need to reconcile the provisions list against what I've actually got. It'll take most of the morning." "I'll be here," Caroline said. She was. She came at 5 o'clock with the ledger and sat across from Margaret at the workbench, and they worked through the numbers together side by side. And it was not comfortable, and it was not easy, and it was exactly what needed to happen. On the 6th day, Nathaniel came to the kitchen in the afternoon. This had become, Margaret had noticed, A pattern: he came in the afternoons when the day's most urgent work was done, and he sat at the bench. And sometimes they talked through practical matters, and sometimes they talked about something else entirely, and Margaret had stopped being surprised by this and started being something more complicated than surprised. He sat down and said, "Frank Tilden is on his feet." "I know," she said. "Jesse told me this morning. He wanted to come thank you himself, but Hatch wouldn't let him out of the bunkhouse." Margaret smiled at that. Hatch is turning into a very capable man to have in a crisis. "He is." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "You did that." "He did that. I just gave him something to do with what was already in him." Nathaniel looked at her with that expression, the one she had catalogued, and still didn't have a complete name for. "You do that for people," he said. "You see what's in them, and you give it somewhere to go." He paused. "It's not a common thing." Margaret looked at the pot she was tending and said nothing. "My wife had it," he said quietly. The kitchen was very still. Margaret looked up. Nathaniel met her eyes. I'm not making a comparison," he said. "I'm saying it's rare, and I know how rare it is because I've spent the last 18 months in a house full of people and been lonelier than I'd ever been in my life. And I walk into this kitchen, and that's..." He stopped. "That's not true in here." She looked at him steadily. She could feel the exact weight and shape of what was being said and what was not being said, and she knew, with the particular clarity she had about people, that this man was not performing. He was not working towards something. He was just being honest in the way people are honest when a storm has stripped away the usual reasons to be otherwise. "This kitchen is full of people," she said carefully. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what I mean." She looked at him for a long moment, and she thought about what it would cost her to let herself believe what she was hearing: the price of being wrong, the price of wanting something and not getting it, the price she had paid before in smaller versions of this exact gamble. She thought about all the ways a woman in her position had learned to not want things out loud, to keep her wanting small and private and unlikely to be seen, and therefore unlikely to be taken from her. And then she thought about the promise she had made herself on the road to Hawthorne Estate. Not the kitchen promise. The other one, the one she hadn't even articulated to herself fully until this moment. She was not going to be small anymore. "Nathaniel," she said, and his name in her voice was something she chose deliberately, the deliberate dropping of the formality that had been a kind of wall between them. "You should know that I am aware of exactly how this looks. Who I am, where I came from, where you're standing. I am not naive about any of that. Neither am I," he said. "And I'm not going to pretend I don't know what you're saying. Or that I don't..." She stopped, breathed, "that I don't feel the weight of it. Because I do." He was very still. "But I also need you to understand something," she said. "I came to this kitchen to survive, and I stayed in it because the work mattered, and the people mattered, and the food I made mattered. That's not going to change. Whoever I am to this estate, in whatever capacity, the work comes first. My kitchen comes first. The people I feed come first." "I know that," he said. "I need to be sure you know it," she said. "Because I've seen what happens to women who let something else come first, and I'm not..." She stopped herself. "Finished, I won't." Nathaniel Hawthorne looked at her across the workbench with steady eyes and said, "Margaret, I wouldn't want you to." The silence after that was different from any silence they'd shared before. It was the silence of something having been said clearly between two people and landing without damage, which is one of the rarest things there is. Outside, the wind had shifted again. Margaret could hear it in the way the sound changed around the stone walls. She turned to the window, not to look out but to listen. "It's slowing," she said. Nathaniel listened too. "You can hear that?" "The pitch changes when the wind backs off," she said. "My father taught me. Back home, when he'd been at the warehouse all day, he'd come in and tell us whether the week was going to be hard or easier just from the sound of the wind at the corner of the house." She paused. "He was usually right." "Was he right about the hard weeks?" "Almost always." She turned back to the pot. "He got good at knowing they were coming." He never got good at telling us ahead of time. Why not? She thought about it. He didn't want to worry us, she said. He thought protecting us from knowing meant protecting us from being afraid. She stirred the pot. It didn't. It just meant we were afraid without information, which is the worst kind of afraid. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then, is that why you told the men the truth that first morning? About the provisions? Partly, she said, and partly because they deserved it. They're the ones who have to live with the situation either way. The least anyone can do is tell them what it actually is. He nodded. He was quiet again in that comfortable way he had, the way of a man who didn't feel the need to fill silence, which was a quality Margaret respected more the better she knew him. Then he said the lawyer arrives when the road opens. There's going to be an official process, the loans, the documents, the full accounting. It's going to be complicated, and it's probably going to be public in ways that aren't comfortable. I know. Your records are going to be central to it. Your testimony, potentially. I know that, too. He looked at her. Are you prepared for that? For what it might mean to be that visible, in that kind of situation? She thought about it honestly. She thought about what visibility had always cost her, about the ways she had learned to manage it, to stay behind the stove, where no one could see her clearly enough to aim at her. She thought about standing on the mounting block in the snow, talking to 50 people. Yes, she said. He nodded slowly. And then the wind outside shifted one more time. Definitively, with the decisive quality of something making up its mind, and the sound of the storm began to change, not gone, not yet, but lessening, pulling back, the way all hard things eventually do, when they've finished saying what they came to say. Margaret ladled soup into a bowl and set it on the counter. Eat something, she said to Nathaniel. It's been a long few days. He looked at the bowl for a moment. Then he picked up the spoon and ate, and the kitchen held them both in the warmth of the fire, and neither of them said anything else, and neither of them needed to. The storm was ending. What came next was going to ask a great deal of both of them. But for the length of that meal, the fire was steady, and the soup was hot, and the wind outside was learning, slowly, to be quiet. And Margaret Ellis stood at her stove and felt, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was not afraid of any of it. The road opened on the 9th day. Margaret knew it before anyone told her, the same way she had known the storm was ending by the sound, by the particular quality of the morning silence that meant the wind had finally moved on and taken the worst of itself with it. She was at the stove at 4 o'clock as always, and she heard Tom Greer's boots on the path at 4:40, and she heard the difference in his step. Not the careful, deliberate walk of a man moving through snow. Something quicker, something with relief in it. He appeared at the door with cold air coming off his coat and said Johnson got through to the first bend. Road's passable, how passable? Slow going. But a wagon can make it. He came in and stood at the stove and held his hands out the way he always did. The lawyer's going to be able to come through. I know, she said. He looked at her carefully. You ready for that? She thought about the question, the same way she thought about all of Tom Greer's questions, which was seriously, because he asked them that way and he deserved answers that matched. Ready as I can be, she said, which I think is enough. He nodded. The men are talking about what's going to happen. About the trial. He stopped. Whether what? She said. Whether Mr. Hawthorne is going to be able to hold on to the estate. He said it plainly, the way bad news should be said. If the debts are what they think they are. If Hartwell pushes for full repayment. Margaret set her spoon down. She had been thinking about this for 4 days, turning it over the way you turn something over when you're not quite ready to look at the side of it that frightens you. The records will help, she said. My records and the original manifests Aldrin pulled. If we can show that the loans were fraudulent, that Nathaniel's signature was forged, then the debt isn't legally his to carry. That's what the lawyer's for, Tom said. Yes. She picked her spoon back up. And that's what the 9 days were for, too. Getting every number right. having everything documented so clean that nobody can argue with it. She paused. I've been working on it every evening since the storm started. Tom looked at her for a moment. Every evening. There wasn't much else to do after midnight, she said. He made the sound that was his version of a laugh, short, genuine, quickly contained. No, he said, I reckon there wasn't. The lawyer arrived 2 days later. His name was Beaumont, not connected to Margaret's former employer, just a coincidence of name that she noted and set aside, and he was a small, precise man with quick eyes and the particular manner of someone who had spent a long time in rooms where a great deal depended on small distinctions. He came with a clerk who took notes in a hand so small it was nearly illegible, and he set up in Nathaniel's study, and he worked through the documents for 6 hours on the first day without stopping except to ask questions. Margaret was called in on the second afternoon. She brought her notebook. She brought the copies she had made of every page. She sat across from Beaumont at Nathaniel's desk, with Nathaniel to her left, and laid everything out in front of her in the order she had organized it, which was chronological and cross-referenced, and precise enough that when Beaumont asked his first question, she could answer it before he finished asking it. He looked up from his notes. You kept these records yourself, he said. From my second week at the estate, she said, before you had reason to believe there was fraudulent activity. Before I knew the scope of it, but I suspected something was off from early on. I keep records as a habit. My father taught me that if you work for someone else, you keep your own account of what you've done and what you've been given and what you've spent. Because otherwise your version of the story depends entirely on someone else's record of it. Beaumont looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man revising something. Your father was a wise man, he said. He was, she said. He also got cheated out of 3 months' wages at the end of his life because he didn't have a piece of paper to prove what he was owed. I've never forgotten that. Beaumont looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel said nothing, but something in his face was very still and very present. Miss Ellis, Beaumont said, turning back to her, these records are among the most useful pieces of evidence I've encountered in this kind of case. The cross-referencing against the original supply manifests alone. He stopped himself, as if he'd been about to say something admiring and wasn't sure the occasion called for admiration. They're very useful. I'll need to retain copies. You can keep those, she said, and slid the copied pages across the desk. I have the originals. He looked at the pages. He looked at her. He wrote something in his own notebook that she couldn't read from across the desk, and she didn't try to. How certain are you of the weight discrepancies in the curing shed? He said. If this goes to a formal hearing and opposing counsel challenges your methodology. I weighed each barrel myself, she said. I have the weights written down with the date and time of each measurement. I have the original labels with the stated weights, which I kept intact. And I have Ruth Haynes as a witness to the discrepancy in barrel 7, which she identified independently before I told her what I'd found. Beaumont set his pen down. He looked at Nathaniel again. This time Nathaniel did say something. I told you, he said quietly. Beaumont picked his pen back up. Yes, he said. You did. The formal process took 3 weeks. It was not quick and it was not clean, and there were 2 days in the second week when Hartwell's representative arrived in person and sat in Nathaniel's parlor and said things that Margaret did not hear directly, but that she pieced together from Nathaniel's face when he came to the kitchen afterward. He's claiming the loans were legitimate, Nathaniel said. He sat at the bench and did not reach for the coffee she set in front of him immediately the way he usually did. That there's documentation on his end showing my full knowledge and consent. Forged documentation, Margaret said yes, but he has it. Then we show the court what we have, she said, and we let them weigh the two against each other. She sat down across from him. Nathaniel, your signature on those documents, Beaumont said it's not a perfect forgery. He said an expert would see the differences. He said probably. He said probably, because that's the honest answer. But probably is better than nothing, and we have more than probably. She folded her hands on the table. We have 9 weeks of records that show exactly what this estate had, what it spent, what it lost, and what someone was systematically removing from it. Hartwell's paperwork says you signed those loans. Our paperwork shows what was happening to the money. Those two things together tell a story, and it's a clear one. Nathaniel looked at her. Under the exhaustion in his face was something she had been watching build for weeks, a particular quality of trust, the kind that doesn't announce itself but shows up in the way a person breathes, in the way they let their guard down just slightly in your presence, in the way they tell you the real thing instead of the managed version. I keep thinking, he said, about where I was when all of this was happening. What I was doing while Caroline was making these decisions, while the stores were being depleted, while he stopped. I was in this house. I was 30 yards away from all of it, and I saw none of it. You were grieving, she said. That's not an excuse. No, she said carefully, it isn't an excuse, but it's a reason. Those are different things. She paused. An excuse says the wrong thing didn't happen. A reason says the wrong thing happened, and here's what was true at the same time. Both things being true doesn't cancel either one out. He looked at her. You've thought about that distinction. I've needed it, she said, for myself, more than once. The words sat between them with the particular honesty of something confessed without planning to confess it, and Nathaniel heard them the way she had come to know. He heard things fully, without immediately responding. In the way of someone who understood that some things needed a moment to land before anything was added to them. What did you need it for, he said, after that moment. She thought about her father, and the warehouse, and the boarding house in Louisville, and the years of being looked past and talked over and reduced to the single most visible thing about her body. She thought about every room she had walked into and immediately understood was not going to receive her well, and the way she had learned to make herself smaller in those rooms, to take up less space, to want less, to say less, to be less, so that the discomfort her presence caused other people could be minimized, as though their discomfort was something she had any responsibility for. I spent a long time, she said, believing that if people couldn't see my value, it meant the value wasn't there. And every time someone made me feel that way, I told myself there was a reason they were scared, or small, or carrying something heavy, and the reason was true, and it helped me not to hate them. She met his eyes. But it also helped me forgive them faster than I should have. And stay in situations longer than I should have, because if there was always a reason, I never had to name the thing as wrong. Nathaniel was very still. This kitchen was the first place I stopped doing that, she said. The first place I decided the reason was not the same as the right, and that I was going to name what was wrong and address it, and still try to understand why. But not in the order where the understanding came first, and the naming never came at all. He said quietly, I'm glad you didn't leave, so am I, she said. Outside, the sound of the estate going about its daily work came through the walls, boots on stone, voices at a distance, the creak and movement of a place that was alive and functioning. The sound of what she had built here, or helped build, or coaxed into existing by simply showing up every morning and refusing to be less than she was. She stood up and went back to the stove. Drink your coffee, she said. It's getting cold. He drank it. The hearing took place in Lexington on a Thursday in late February. Margaret rode in the wagon with Nathaniel and Beaumont and Tom Greer, who had insisted on coming, and Ruth Haynes, who had not been asked but had appeared at the wagon in her good coat, with her mouth set in a line that dared anyone to tell her she didn't belong there. Nobody told her. The courthouse was a cold, high-ceilinged room that smelled of wood polish and old paper, and it was full of people who had the particular look people gathered to watch something important happen. Hartwell's representative was a tall man named Cord, who wore his authority the way some men wear expensive coats as a signal meant to be read from a distance. He looked at Margaret when she walked in, with a look that said he had already decided she was not someone he needed to concern himself with. That look was familiar to her. She had been underestimated by better men than Cord. She sat beside Beaumont, and she put her notebook on the table in front of her, and she folded her hands, and she waited. The proceeding moved the way legal proceedings move slowly, with the particular rhythm of designed to be thorough rather than efficient. Cord presented Hartwell's claim. He presented the loan documents with Nathaniel's apparent signature. He presented a ledger of payments and a narrative of the estate's financial history that was technically accurate in its numbers, and entirely misleading in its presentation of how those numbers had come to be what they were. Beaumont presented the counter case with the same precision he had brought to every document review: methodical, complete, no flourish and no drama, just the clear weight of evidence laid down in order. He presented the handwriting analysis. He presented the supply records. He presented the timeline that showed, month by month, the systematic discrepancy between what the book said it had and what it actually had. Then he called Margaret. She walked to the front of the room and she did not look at Cord. She sat in the chair that was indicated to her, and she set her notebook in her lap, and she looked at Beaumont. He asked her to describe the records she had kept and why she had kept them. She described them clearly and specifically. She explained her methodology. She explained how she had cross-referenced the inventory against the original supply manifests, why she had weighed the barrels herself, rather than relying on the labels. When she had first suspected that the discrepancies were not accidental, and what had made her certain. She answered every question Beaumont asked without consulting her notes, because she had been over these numbers enough times that they lived in her, the way recipes lived in her, not memorized exactly, but known. The way you know something you've worked with until it becomes part of how you think. Then Cord stood up. He looked at her for a moment with the particular preparation of a man about to say something he believes is going to be effective. "Miss Ellis," he said, "you arrived at Hawthorne Estate approximately 9 weeks before the events you've described. Is that correct?" "That's correct. And prior to that, you worked in domestic service." "As a cook?" "Yes, no legal training. No accounting training." "No formal training," she said. "My father kept household accounts and he taught me his method." "Your father." Cord paused in the way people pause when they're about to use something against you. "He was," she said. "A good one." "Miss Ellis, the records you've presented this court is being asked to place significant weight on a notebook kept by a domestic worker with no formal credentials, against official loan documents bearing what appears to be the property owner's signature. Can you explain why we should consider your records more reliable than legally executed documents?" The room was very quiet. Margaret looked at Cord steadily. She had known this question was coming, or a version of it, because it was the obvious question, the one that would have been easy and effective if she had been the person he thought she was. "Because," she said, "my records contain actual quantities measured at actual times by my own hand, with the original labels as corroboration, and Ruth Haynes's independent witness, and the original supply manifests from the estate's own files that match my numbers against the documented records showing different numbers in the ledger Miss Whitaker maintained." She kept her voice level and clear. "The loan documents bear a signature that a handwriting expert has testified shows 14 specific deviations from Mr. Hawthorne's authenticated signature in 3 samples from prior years. My records don't require you to trust my credentials. They require you to follow the numbers. The numbers are consistent. The numbers are corroborated. And the numbers tell a story that the loan documents, if authentic, cannot account for." Cord looked at her. She looked back at him. "Furthermore," she said, "I kept those records before I knew there was anything to find. I kept them because I was a woman in a position that had no formal protections, and I knew from experience that a woman in that position either keeps her own account or she has no account at all." She paused one beat, just enough. "My father taught me that. The warehouse taught him." The room did not make a sound. Cord looked at his notes. He looked back at her. He had the expression of a man who has just encountered something that his preparation did not include. "No further questions," he said. The ruling came 6 days later. Beaumont read it to them in Nathaniel's study, and he read it in the careful, neutral voice of a lawyer who has learned not to inflect good news too soon, in case the listening has made him miss something. But the language was clear, and the conclusion was unambiguous. The loan documents were ruled fraudulent. The forgery finding was upheld. Hartwell's claim against the estate was dismissed. The debt was not Nathaniel's to pay. Beaumont set the paper down and looked at both of them. "Congratulations," he said, in a tone that suggested he reserved the word for moments that genuinely warranted it. Nathaniel looked at Margaret. She looked at the paper on the desk. She felt the news the way you feel something after you've been braced against it for a long time, not in a rush, but slowly, as the bracing releases and the reality of the outcome finally has room to move through you. She breathed out. "Good," she said. Nathaniel stood up. He walked around the desk and he stopped in front of her, and he looked at her with the full, unguarded expression of a man who had stopped managing what showed on his face around her some time ago and hadn't gone back. "Margaret," he said. "I know," she said. She looked at him. "I think so," she said. "But say it plainly, Nathaniel. I've spent enough of my life translating things that should have been said directly." Something moved in his expression, recognition, and something warmer than recognition. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not in the kitchen. Not as the cook, not in any capacity that keeps you at the back of this estate, while the rest of it goes forward." He held her eyes. "I want you here as my partner, in every way that word can mean." The room was very still. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the road she had come in on 9 weeks ago, with everything she owned in a and a recipe book that had been her mother's. She thought about the rusted stove and the half-filled barrels and the thin smile and the laughter on the path and mounting a block in the snow and the 50 people who had looked at her and decided to believe her. She thought about Frank Tilden's fever and Hatch's handwriting and Jessie on the step in the early mornings and Ruth appearing in her good coat without being asked and Tom Greer saying very quietly the first name she had given him permission to use. She thought about what she had told Nathaniel in the kitchen during the storm, that she would not be small anymore. That she had made a promise to herself, and she intended to keep it. She thought about the woman they had sent to a forgotten kitchen to fail. "Yes," she said, "but I keep the kitchen." He looked at her. "The work matters to me," she said. "The people I feed matter to me. That doesn't change because of anything else." "I wouldn't want it to," he said. "Then yes," she said, "I'll stay." What Nathaniel Hawthorne did then was not what the novels would have described, which was part of why it mattered. He did not sweep her into anything. He reached out and took her hand in both of his. The way you hold something you want to be careful with, and he held it, and he looked at her, and that was all, and it was entirely sufficient. Beaumont cleared his throat from somewhere near the window. They both looked at him. He was studying the ceiling with profound interest. Margaret laughed the real kind, the kind that comes up without permission, and Nathaniel's face opened into something she had not seen on it before. Something that started at the corners of his eyes and moved through his whole expression like a fire catching properly in a stove that's been cold too long. Spring came to Hawthorne Estate, the way spring always comes to Kentucky, not all at once, but in the convincing kind of increments that make you believe in it before it's fully arrived. The mud, then the first green under the mud. The mornings that smelled different. The sound of the birds coming back, announcing themselves with the cheerful lack of tact that Margaret had always found more comforting than any cautious hope. The estate was different in spring than the frozen, frightened place it had been in those 9 days of the storm. The legal resolution had settled something in the air, not just the financial reality of it, but the moral weight, the knowledge that the truth had been told and had been heard, and had mattered in the specific ways that truth is supposed to matter. Caroline Whitaker had stayed. She had kept her position, reduced in scope, her oversight now shared with systems that made one person's concealment impossible. She worked beside Margaret in the mornings on supply management, with a humility that had cost her something real to acquire and that was, because of that cost, entirely genuine. Ruth Haynes had taken on a broader supervisory role over the household, which Nathaniel had suggested and which Margaret had seconded, because Ruth's competence had been visible for 6 years to anyone who had been willing to look, and the storm had removed the last excuse not to look. Hatch had taken over care of the small medical stores that Margaret had organized during the storm, and he came to the kitchen 2 mornings a week to consult with her on provisions and to continue his informal education in things his mother had started and circumstance had interrupted. He was, Margaret had concluded, one of the most quietly capable people she had ever met, and she told him so directly, because her father had taught her to name a thing when you saw it. Jessie still sat on the step in the early mornings. She still made sure his bowl was a little fuller than it needed to be. The old stone kitchen was no longer old in the way it had been old when she arrived, old meaning abandoned, old meaning forgotten, old meaning the place where they sent you when they wanted you to disappear. It was old now the way that a good building is old, the way that wear and use and care have made something more solid rather than less. The stove she had coaxed back to life in her first hour had become the center of an operation that fed not only the estate's workers, but increasingly the surrounding community. Word had moved the way word moves in small communities, which is slowly at first, and then everywhere, that the cook at Hawthorne Estate knew things about food preservation and winter management that were worth knowing, and that she was willing to teach them. Women came on Thursday afternoons, some from the farms to the south, some from the town, some from places further than that, who had heard through third and fourth parties about the woman at Hawthorne, who had kept 50 people fed through the worst storm in a decade, and whose Thursday sessions were free of charge and served a meal at the end. Margaret taught them what her mother had taught her, what her father's careful poverty had taught her, what 9 weeks in a forgotten kitchen had clarified and sharpened into something she could pass on. She taught them the arithmetic of feeding people when resources were scarce. She taught them how to read a root cellar, how to manage a winter store, how to make a meal from modest ingredients that tasted like something made with care rather than desperation. She taught them because the knowledge was worth passing on, but also because every woman who sat at her workbench on a Thursday afternoon was a version of someone she had been once, or was afraid of being, or was trying not to become, and if the knowledge helped one of them hold on through a hard season, then the passing of it was the most important work she did in that kitchen, more important even than the feeding. On a Thursday evening in late April, after the last of the women had gone home, and the kitchen was clean and the fire was banked, Nathaniel came in the way he always came in now, not knocking, because they had stopped that formality 2 months ago, but pausing in the doorway just long enough that she knew he was there before he crossed the threshold. He sat at the bench. She poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him. "Tom says the east field is ready to plant," he said. "Tom's right," she said. "I've been watching the soil." She had no particular expertise in farming, but she had her father's habit of observing the physical world with the attention of someone who understands that the physical world is always telling you something, if you're willing to listen. "Another week and it'll be time. It's going to be a good season," he said. "I think so." She looked at him. "You sound like you believe it." "I do." He wrapped both hands around his cup, the way he did when he was sitting with something, rather than moving through it. "I didn't for a long time. Believe in the seasons here." After Eleanor, he stopped, started again differently. "I stopped being able to see the estate as something that had a future. It felt like it was already in the past tense." He paused. "It doesn't feel that way anymore." Margaret looked at him. "What changed it?" He said, though she knew. He met her eyes. "A woman who showed up in the worst kitchen on the property and refused to treat it as a place things died," he said. "Who kept records in the dark before she knew why. Who stood on a mounting block in a snowstorm and told 50 people the truth because she believed they deserved it." He held her gaze. "Who decided somewhere on the road to this place, that she was done being less than what she was. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. She felt the full weight of what had been built here, not just the kitchen, not just the legal resolution, not just the Thursday sessions or the organized root cellar or the unified meal schedule, but the thing underneath all of that. The thing that had no practical name, but that every person on this estate could feel when they walked through the yard on a morning, when the work was going well and the food was good, and they knew. With the specific knowledge of people who have been through hard things together, that they were not going to be abandoned in the next hard thing. I made myself a promise, she said, before I came here. That I was going to stop shrinking. She paused. I didn't know what that was going to look like. I didn't know it was going to look like this. Does it look the way you hoped? He said. She thought about it honestly, the way she always thought about his questions. It looks better, she said. Outside, the Kentucky evening was doing what Kentucky evenings do in late April, going down slow and gold through the new leaves, taking its time, not wasting any of it. The estate was settling into its evening quiet. The day's work done, the fires banked in the bunkhouse, and the laundry and the stable. And here in the old stone kitchen that was not old in that abandoned way anymore, the last fire of the day breathed and held. Margaret Ellis had come to Hawthorne Estate with a recipe book and a suitcase, and a promise she had made to herself in the dark. She had kept the promise. She had kept the kitchen. She had fed an estate through its worst winter. She had stood in a courtroom and said what was true with such precision and such plainness that the truth had been undeniable. She had reached into the most forgotten corners of this place and found what was worth saving. She had done it without apology and without permission and without once pretending to be less than she was. And the doing of it had changed not just her life, but the life of every person who had come into the warmth of that stove and been fed by her hands and her care and her stubborn, unshakable belief that a person's worth was never, not ever. Not for anyone, not for any reason determined by what they looked like when they walked through the door. The woman they had sent away to a forgotten kitchen had become the reason the whole estate came back to life, and she was just getting started.